I want to tell you about something that makes my blood absolutely boil, and I imagine it does yours too. Not that it's new, in fact, it's older than I want to admit, but I read an article just recently that reminded me of this. There are so many religious organizations throughout the world that refuse to let women have positions of power and authority. Flatly refuse. Today, in 2025, this injustice is made even worse by the fact that they use the Bible to justify it. And yet, that is not only a gross misrepresentation, not only is it just trying to center the patriarchy and keep people in power who already have power, but it's a bold-faced lie. Yes, of course, you can spend some time in the Bible and find some places where it says some things about women. Absolutely. I'm familiar with those as well. So before you jump into the comments and just share those again, just read this. The whole thing, front to back. Look for all of the places where people are laid out as even. Men and women created equal, Jew, Gentile, there's no difference between them. That's just one off the top of my head. But today specifically, I want to talk about this because the first words in the New Testament, ones we almost always skip over, right there in Matthew 1. We jump them because we want to get straight to the Advent story. We want to hear about wise men. We want to hear about Jesus. And yet, the writer of Matthew was so convinced that it was important for us to know this, that he put it right at the beginning of this book. And it's really terribly boring, which is why you would skip it all the time. But I want to argue that there is a theological time bomb knitted into the very fabric of the book of Matthew, one that we should sit up and take notice and realize, holy moly, how did I never notice that was there before? Well, because some of it sounds a little bit like this. Right off the top, we get these begats, this long genealogical story of who belongs to who. So Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac was the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Aram. I'm going to quit before it gets into words that I really can't pronounce, and also before I completely lose you. But the reality is, it has this long, long list of all these people. And if you just skim through it quickly, and if you don't know maybe a little bit more, like if you haven't read parts of the Old Testament, if you don't know some of these names and some of these stories, it would be so easy to miss it. But buried in the middle of all of these names, this guy had this son, this guy had this son, this guy had this son, there are women in there too. Now, I want you to pause for a minute and think about how important that is. We know that this was written by men for men in a time when very few people could read and almost none of them were women, in a time where women were treated as possessions, in a time when the patriarchy was stronger than ever and empire ruled. Unfortunately, that's not all that different from today, because even today we have religious organizations using these same words to prevent women from being part of the middle of the story. But I want us to look at these 5 particular women that stand out in this book or this list of genealogy, because I want to title them, just because we're coming up on Christmas and we're talking about naughty and nice lists. These are 5 naughty women in the history of Jesus. Before I get to them, I want you to jump into the comments right now and type out the names of them. There are 5. They exist in other places in the Bible, and they're critically important. So I'll give you a second. You can pause the video, type in those 5. And if you can do it without checking the first chapter of Matthew, that'd be amazing. So let's get into them. And now's the time that you realize I already gave you part of this message. I read through far enough to find Tamar in this list. Now, for lots of us who live in the Western world, Tamar doesn't stand out as a particular gender of name because we're not used to the naming conventions of the ancient Hebrews. But Tamar has a scandalous story. Honestly, one of my favorite women in the Bible. I've definitely preached on her. I want to make a video about her someday, but it's going to have a pretty significant trigger warning on it because she had to pose as a sex worker and may or may not have had relations with her own father-in-law just to make sure that she was taken care of. That's a pretty brutal story, and she's in the genealogy of Jesus. Which then leads us to Rahab, who all we really know about her is she was definitely not a Hebrew. She was one of the outsiders. She was, again, a sex worker. And without her, huge swaths of humanity would not have existed. So, complete hero and recognized as being other and outside and naughty. Ruth is next. Now, you might know a little bit about Ruth. She gets an entire book in here written about her. She, again, was a complete outsider. She was a Moabitess. Not only was that not a Hebrew, but also she was like an enemy of the Hebrews. And because of her deep love for her mother-in-law and her humble and yet sometimes tricky ways that she worked within the system, she gets to be in Jesus' lineage as well. In fact, without her, there's no King David. You probably remember that name. Speaking of King David, that leads us to number 4 in our list, Bathsheba. And she is even named as wife of Uzziah. It was so important to the author of Matthew that Bathsheba's name didn't just sit there, that the murder of her husband and her subsequent sexual abuse was named right in there. Bathsheba, wife of Uzziah, the woman that David took as his own and killed to do so. And then the last of them is Mary herself. You probably could have guessed that one, but you were thinking, oh, we're only looking back far in the history books. But Mary, Jesus' own mother, young and unwed, pregnant with an illegitimate child, her husband planning to set her away gently just to at least not embarrass her too much and not himself too much. And yet she kept this baby that was growing in her. And without her, there is no story of Jesus. There is no New Testament. There is no Christianity. 5 women who would very easily be on the naughty list if we bothered to listen to the structure of our world today, or even the world that many years ago. And yet, without them, there's no Christmas, there's no Advent, there's no Christianity, because there's no Jesus. So what do we do with this? Well, first off, we take those organizations who claim that women have no place in the structure of their organization and give them a piece of our minds. That is a totally unacceptable reading of the Bible, and we need to stop that. It's 2025, people. And secondly, outside of those organizations, if you feel like maybe you're not ready for Advent, you're maybe too deep in the naughty list. Maybe you don't fit in whatever way, shape, or form. Maybe that same patriarchy doesn't leave a space for you, or that same religious organization decides that you don't have a space in it. Well, I want to reassure you, friend, Jesus has a space for you. Advent has a space for you. This is a time built specifically for people who don't feel like they belong. And yes, we might name hope and joy and peace and love as some of those big names of what we're going to talk about. But in the midst of that, and in the midst of our beautiful and complicated, messy Advent story, is also grief and injustice and homelessness and oppression and empire and systemic failings. I don't think we've come very far as human race, but what we can do is lean into the beautiful story of Advent. And so if this year you are feeling like maybe Advent isn't quite ready for you, or you're not quite ready for it, friend, you are exactly where you need to be. And I want to invite you to join with siblings all around the world who are going to step into Advent together. And we're going to have Advent videos starting on December 1st, running right to the 25th. They're going to just be 3 minutes long, a little slice to remind you that even in the complicated and the messy and the unjust and the unwed, Advent has a space for you, and God shows up in the middle of it. Along with those videos, I want to invite you to download my new Advent devotional, No Room at the Inn, an Advent Call to Justice. This is the only Advent devotional that weaves together contemplative anti-perfectionism with a fierce, non-negotiable, anti-oppressive call to systemic justice. This is the Advent devotional for the rest of us. I reassure you, Hallmark is not interested in this version of the Christmas story. But it's so real, and it's so honest, and you will find yourself in its pages. So I invite you to follow this link, or there'll be a link in the show notes below here as well, where you can download the Advent devotional. It's free to you if you wish. If you want to pay, you can as well. And I invite you to watch the videos, be part of this, and join in an Advent for the rest of us. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.